Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Carrie Ryan. I'm the lead curator for learning at M+, and I'd like to welcome you all today to our Lars Nitve keynote lecture series featuring Glenn D. Lowry, director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It's such a pleasure that we're able to host him here, and I'm grateful to see you all. I just wanted to share a couple housekeeping items while the rest of the audience makes their way in. Please be mindful of your cell phones and turn off the ringer. Just make sure it's turned off. Our program is conducted in English, so if you would like to listen in Cantonese or Mandarin, do make sure you get a headset so you can follow along with the discussion. The program is being recorded and live streamed. For today's program, Glenn will start off by presenting a presentation, and then Suhanya Rafael, director of M+, will join him for a conversation. So we'll try and open up for a Q&A at the end if we have time, and you can scan the QR code on our slide here, which lets you type in your question in English or Chinese, and we'll put it forward to the speakers when we get to that part of the program today. So now I'd like to welcome Suhanya, who will introduce Glenn to you and welcome you all to the presentation today. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Very, very nice to have you here. And disappointed that it started to rain, but never mind. It's just magnificent for us to be here to welcome you to our 5th lecture, titled the Lars Nitve Keynote Lecture Series in honor of our inaugural director, Lars Nitve, who was so instrumental in putting our beautiful museum together. This keynote lecture series invites renowned artists, scholars, thinkers to inspire us with their insights on broader cultural ideas and sort of urgent topics of our time as well. The lecture series has been generously supported by the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation, Hong Kong, for which we are deeply grateful. Now, this afternoon, I am so honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Glenn Lowry, the David Rockefeller Director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It is the oldest museum that focuses its collections and exhibitions solely on modern and contemporary art in a sort of shockingly avant-garde moment established a century ago. Glenn has been at the helm of MoMA since 1995, and he has just announced this week his plans to step down next year after 30 years of leadership. So before steering MoMA into the 21st century, Glenn had his beginnings in New York City and grew up in Williamstown, Massachusetts. This small college town is home to Williams College, where Glenn received his BA. He then studied the history of art at Harvard University, where he earned his MA and PhD, focusing on pre-modern Islamic arts and culture. And his thesis was on the tomb of Humayun, a Mughal emperor. He began his career as a curator of Oriental art at the Rhode Island School of Design Museum in 1981. This is really one of the top-ranking art schools in the US, and the museum has a wonderful encyclopedic teaching collection. In 1983, he was appointed the first director of the Mascarell Museum of Art at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. A year later, he became curator of Near Eastern art at the Smithsonian Institution's Arthur M. Sackler Gallery and Freer Gallery of Art, now the National Museum of Asian Art at Washington, D.C. From 1990 to 1995, he was the director of the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto. Glenn is the 6th and longest-serving director of MoMA. During his tenure, he has overseen the physical transformation of the museum's campus through 2 building campaigns, one in 2004, designed by Yoshio Taniguchi, and more recently in 2019, designed by Dilla Scofidio and Renfro. These 2 expansions have more than doubled the size of MoMA's galleries, quintupled its endowment, and created an education and research center, and has inspired actually a new model for the presentation of modern and contemporary art. A leader and collaborator, he spearheaded MoMA's merger in 2000 with the Contemporary Art Center PS1, Fun as well, founded by Alana Heiss in the 1970s, in the building that was once a public school at Queen's. In 2015, he worked with Thelma Godden, director of the Studio Museum in Harlem, a museum that gives voice to its local community, to launch a joint fellowship program for emerging professionals in the arts. Glenn will no doubt elaborate more on the history of modern art museums, but I just want to provide a little context for our audiences before I turn the microphone over. MoMA was founded in 1929 by three fearless women: Lily Bliss, Mary Queen Sullivan, and Abby Aldrich Rockefeller. This was during the historic financial crisis known as the Wall Street crash that had global repercussions. And throughout MoMA's history, there have been many powerful, insightful women that have shaped its path. This includes Agnes Gund, President Emerita of MoMA, a truly visionary collector that some have called the all-round fairy godmother of contemporary art world. Aggie is an advocate for art education in public schools and steadfastly supports overlooked and women artists. She co-founded the Center for Curatorial Leadership in 2007, which partners with MoMA on the International Curatorial Institute. And two of our current and former colleagues at M+, Russell Storr and P. Lee, are beneficiaries of this prominent program, which started in 2014. Similarly, the Venezuelan-born philanthropist Patricia Phelps Cisneros, a collector of Latin American modern and contemporary art, has donated more than 100 pieces from her collection to MoMA and established the Cisneros Institute of the Study of Art from Latin America at MoMA. I wanted to introduce that to you because that level of generosity and vision can also be seen for M+. We have had the largest and most comprehensive collection of contemporary Chinese art in the world enter the museum through the donation of Swiss collector and M+ board member Uli Sieg. Uli is also here today, but I wanted to highlight how important these kinds of unparalleled contributions to our institutions are a very important part of the establishing and foundation of museums for us to think and learn from. So without further ado, I know you're all here to listen to Glenn, so please welcome Glenn Lowry.
Thank you so much, Suhanya, and I can't tell you how thrilled and honored I am to be here giving this lecture that recognizes a dear friend and colleague, Lars Nitve, who has been instrumental in my field, the field of modern art, for decades. And it was through Lars that I first learned about M+ and the incredible work that you are doing here. And Suhanya, I just want to take a moment to salute you and your remarkable staff. This museum sparkles, and it's a joy to walk through its galleries and discover its many surprises and treasures. What I want to do this afternoon is think out loud with you about the idea of imagining a museum of modern art. You know, many of our buildings and our collections feel so substantial. They feel like they're the weight, that they are what a museum is. But actually, what I'm going to try and argue over the course of this afternoon is that actually museums are ideas. And my timer works. That museums are ideas, that at the end of the day, they are imaginaries. They are places of aspiration, of values, of thoughts, as much as they are about the concrete reality of their spaces and their collections. Years ago at the Museum of Modern Art, and if Dorian Chung is here, he might even remember this project, we did a little exercise with our visitors. It was called I Went to MoMA and we invited anyone who came to the museum to share with us what they did when they came to the museum. And over the course of several months, literally thousands of these cards were filled out with little phrases, with drawings, with good wishes. And they got posted on our website. And after even more time, there were 10,000 cards, and then there were 20,000 cards. And eventually, they became a kind of panorama of what our visitors thought when they came to the museum. And three in particular stood out to me. The first, this brain that is growing. That, in other words, coming to the museum was food for the mind. Then there was the one on, I guess, your right, that I entered, I looked, I felt like I'd opened up. That is, the museum was about expansion, about the ways in which you could imagine something different. And then the one that sits now on my desk from Annabelle. I went to MoMA and saw a coat closet, trash, and 2 water fountains. I'm very disappointed. I did not see a dinosaur. You call yourself a museum. Well, I live with that card because it tells me and reminds me that we need to remember always that people come with aspirations, with expectations, and that they create, when they come to the museum, their own imaginaries, their own idea of what the museum is about. And so I'm brought to André Malraux, the great writer, critic, and first minister of culture in France under de Gaulle from 1959 to 1968. And during the 1940s and 50s, he wrote a series of books called the Musée Imaginaire. In English, it was translated to the Museum Without Walls. But that doesn't really describe what he was trying to do. What he was trying to do was express the idea that museums were infinite, not finite, that they needed to be expansive in their embrace of cultures from around the world, as opposed to, at the time in France or even in the United States, being Eurocentric. That actually you needed to build in your mind that imaginary museum that reflected your interests, your ideas, your thoughts, your values, your hopes, your disappointments. And here he is, photographed by Marc Janoux for an article in Paris Match from 1954, presenting to his public his Musée Imaginaire. He stands there dressed nattily in his suit, holding one of the double-page spreads that will soon be scattered on the floor. And what you see on the floor isn't actually the publication that was finalized, it's a draft. And the importance of this image is that the Musée Imaginaire itself was always in flux, was never fixed or permanent. And Malraux invited you, us, to create our own imaginary museums. And so as I think about museums of modern art, and particularly the Museum of Modern Art, where I've been privileged to be the director since 1995, I realize that we are constantly in the process of creating our imaginaries, our ideas of the museum. So what is the Museum of Modern Art? First of all, it's an institution located in the middle of Midtown Manhattan. You see the red Google dot just below Central Park and just above the Empire State Building, for those of you who may not have had a chance to visit us, and I hope you will come soon. And as Suhanya said, we were founded in 1929. And we were founded with four big ideas. Four big ideas. That there was a new art for new audiences not currently served in New York City or anywhere else in the United States. That modern art itself is an unfolding story as art of the past. Today, we take that for granted. But in 1929, the idea that the art of the present could be as important as the art of the past was radical and new and required convincing. That modern art crosses disciplinary boundaries, from painting and sculpture to architecture, film, industrial design, and beyond. That is, that modern art wasn't simple. It was complicated. It was more than just an aesthetic. It was a way of thinking, a way of life, and that the museum could represent that through its collections and programs. Finally, that the Museum of Modern Art itself, from the very moment of its founding, would never be finished, that we would be a work in progress. So what did they mean, the founders of the museum, about new art for new audiences? They meant work like Cézanne's Bather, post-impressionist painting, primarily from Europe, mostly from France, or work like Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night, work that in the 1920s was already almost 40 years old, so it wasn't brand new, and yet, surprisingly, there wasn't a museum in New York willing to show these artists. It's an unfolding story, as important as the art of the past. Our founding director, Alfred Barr, loved diagrams and tried to map what he meant by the idea of modern art. And ultimately, he settled on this notion of modern art being like a torpedo moving through time, with the nose, the ever-advancing future, and the tail, the ever-receding past. And you see here in these two diagrams how over the course of a short period of time, the nose would advance, the tail would recede. But those of you who have very sharp eyes will also see that this is a torpedo carrying primarily European art, and to a lesser degree, the art of North America, and to an even lesser degree, the art of Mexico, not even all of Latin America. Absent is Africa, Asia, and in fact, most of the world. That torpedo, which is an interesting metaphor if you think about it, because torpedoes explode. They're meant to blow up. And so I love the idea that the very essence of how we were conceived was to be explosive, in fact. That idea of this torpedo moving through time gets played out with a collection, at least as it was initially formed, that was first and foremost built on the backbone of painting, because that was what was seen then, despite the idea that we were multidisciplinary, as the primary visual expression, with artists like Picasso and the Demoiselles d'Avignon, or Malevich and the Russian suprematists, or Jackson Pollock, later in the 50s, moving to the United States, the art world itself shifting towards the United States with these kind of overall fields of painting, abstract expressionism. And of course, you can continue that story to the present with artists like Julie Meyretu and many more. But the notion that it was constantly in flux, constantly moving. And the original concept of this torpedo moving through time was that actually, as the nose advanced, the tail would recede, and that our collection would be dynamic, would be actually metabolic, self-renewing, that we would sell off the past. Deaccession is a fancy museum term. We would sell off our past to fund our future. And for a while, that's exactly what we did do, until suddenly a group of trustees realized, why would we give up all of those great works of art that we had fought so hard to make important, not valuable from a financial perspective, but valuable from a historical perspective. And so what we did over time is we put a bungee cord to our tail. The nose keeps advancing, but we kind of drag the tail with us. Modern art crosses disciplinary boundaries. This is a really critical aspect of the Museum of Modern Art. When you think about other museums that might have existed at that time, the idea that you could traverse disciplines and umbrella them under one roof at the same time was new and radical. And so we built a collection of painting, like this one by Matisse, one of my favorites, The Piano Lesson, of sculpture, Brancusi's Bird in Space, drawings like this, Hilma af Klint, prints like Ellen Gallagher's, architecture like this Mies van der Rohe drawing of a skyscraper on Friedrichstrasse in Berlin. Never built, but we were the first department of architecture in a museum, just as we were the first department of industrial design. Here, this beautiful ball bearing. Or film, an entirely new medium of the late 19th and 20th century. Here, Charlie Chaplin, Modern Times. Or photography, Gertrude Arendt. Fields and disciplines that were new, but were believed to be essential to that modern idea, that modern aesthetic, that modern spirit. And that continues today, where we have added performance. Here's Simon Forti's Huddle, or even AI-driven works like Rafik Anadol's Unsupervised. And I suspect that over time, we will add ever more disciplines to the museum as we try to remain true to the art that is being made today. The fourth dimension to this idea of the museum is that we are a work in progress. That is, that there's no fixed shape to the museum, either intellectually, programmatically, or architecturally. And that's best seen in the architecture itself. When we were founded in 1929, we rented rooms in an office building on Fifth Avenue, sort of the main shopping avenue of New York, just to the left of that large building, which is in fact the Plaza Hotel. Tiny little rooms that were rented in 1929. We didn't know then whether we would even survive the stock market crash, which had happened moments before we opened. By 1932, we had moved to a brownstone on 53rd Street, where we still are today, leased to the museum by the Rockefeller family. And again, relatively modest and relatively small spaces, but at least we now had space that we controlled. In 1939, we commissioned our first purpose-built museum by the architects Goodwin and Stone. And as you can see, that building borrows from the international style. It borrows from the language of contemporary architecture, but inserts itself within the kind of domestic environment of the brownstones on the street. By 1954, we had acquired the land behind the museum and commissioned Philip Johnson, who was the founder of our architecture and design department, but also a trustee of the museum, to design a sculpture garden for us that still exists pretty much exactly in the form that he designed. 1964, we commissioned Johnson to build a pavilion immediately to our east, and that's the black building that you see next to the museum. And 4 years later, in 1968, we commissioned him to build an addition that bookended it on our west. Again, you can see how the building really lives within the streetscape of brownstones. The big change came in 1980 when we demolished the building that had been built in 1968 and a couple of other brownstones. We partnered with a developer to build a large museum tower. We kept the spaces below that, and we expanded again. In 2004, we commissioned Yoshio Taniguchi to completely remake our campus, and now you see it from the north side. You can still see Philip Johnson's sculpture garden, but you can see the various wings and pavilions that he incorporated. What you see here is the way in which, over the course of less than 75 years, 9 different architectural projects and expansions, each one responding to a change in audience as our audience grew, change in the art we were showing as art got bigger, weightier, more complicated. We needed spaces capable of responding to that. But we also kept growing with our ideas, and the museum needed to expand to embrace that. And that growth now also includes merging with MoMA PS1, a contemporary art center. I don't know what the right analogy would be here in Hong Kong. Maybe it's Parasite or some other organization of a very different scale, but that addresses a very different audience. You see here a Saturday afternoon warm-up series. It's really a music concert that coincides with the presentation every year of a new architectural project that's up for the summer. The one you see in the background in blue is called Wendy, and it was designed to see whether or not you could create a surface that was coated with a material that would pull pollution out of the air so that the architecture itself would become part of a cleansing process. And it actually worked quite well. But more importantly, MoMA PS1 opened up our possibilities to work with contemporary artists in new and different ways than we could on campus on 53rd Street. MoMA PS1 is literally 10 minutes away by subway, and yet in its own way, it presents a completely different world despite its proximity. And as we continued to expand within the city, we also continued to create new museums online. And you see here Magazine, which is part of our web platform that provides an opportunity for scholars, artists, critics to look, listen, think out loud with us about the museum. But our website also is a place where you can learn about art terms and the digital world, which M+ is part of, and pretty much every museum, is a world in which we have the opportunity not to replicate what we are doing at the museum, but in fact to think about the museum in a completely new and different way. We partnered with Coursera to create online courses. We have over 1.5 million subscribers a year. And of course, we continue to work through social media like YouTube or Twitter, or is it X? I can never remember, where we've done projects with photographers and many others. And what interests me here is that the digital profile of the museum is different than the physical profile of the museum and allows us to work with people from around the world in ways we could never work on site. If 3 million people a year visit us in New York, now almost 45 million people connect with us digitally. So we have parallel and sometimes intersecting worlds that we get to create through these different imaginaries, the imaginary of virtual space and the imaginary of physical space. In 2019, we had the opportunity to again rethink the museum. Here you see a drawing by Diller, Scafidi, and Renfro, the architects that we commissioned, to do a series of interventions into the Taniguchi building, which was then 15 years old, some of the pre-existing spaces from the 1980s and before, but also to add substantially to our west. And one of the gambits, and that's what you see on the left-hand side of this image, a blade stair that is visible from the street, a series of sequence galleries that go up 6 floors, and then yet another tower that we built, the lower floors of which we reserved for gallery space. But this project had as its ambition a radical rethinking of our relationship to the street. Because I think one of the things that had become clear with the Taniguchi project from 2004 was that the museum actually was a kind of filter between the street and the collection. That the building itself needed to have a degree of transparency, needed to be as visible from the street as the street was visible from inside the museum. This sense of liminal space that exists in between, not just as a metaphor for how our minds work, but as a reality that we wanted people to literally flow into the museum. You have some of that here with your great entrance space at M+, but you are situated effectively in a park. We're in the middle of a very busy street. And so one of our imaginaries, and I think it's an imaginary central to the way museums think of themselves, is that we wanted to be part of your life. We didn't want to be separate from your life. We wanted to be an integral part of your life so that you could simply wander in from the street just the way you might wander into a coffee shop, a store, or your own home. You get a sense of how that functions at night when you can see into the museum, when you get a sense of that transparency. And of course, the reverse is true too. When you're in the museum, you feel immediately connected to the street. That sense of flow, of openness, of engagement, I think was utterly essential to how we reimagined the museum. And what do I mean by that? Within the museum, this sense of overlooking galleries, that as you move through the museum, you have views across, but you have views above and below, that the galleries form a network that operates in 3 dimensions. And that's very important because most museums, ours for sure, you tend to move through them in a very linear way, in a direction. And as you'll see in a moment, one of our goals, one of our aspirations, was to move away from that linearity, to move away from the prescription that this follows that. Just a custom-built space that we'd never had before, a studio that was tuned for sound. Here you see David Tudor's Rainforest that we premiered at the museum in 2019 when we opened. But you also, again, look out onto the street. You never lose contact with the street as an active presence within the museum. So what do I mean by reimagining the museum? I mean rethinking the kind of idea of the institution, rethinking the way we imagine the relationship between any one gallery and another gallery, between any one visitor and another visitor, between our visitors and our collection, between the artists we represent, and the way in which you encounter those artists. And you see here Jack Whitten's painting Atopolis for Edouard Glissant. Glissant was a Caribbean poet and philosopher. Atopolis is a name derived from an exhibition of 2014 that took place in Mons in Europe. But more importantly, it means nowhere, a nowhere place, a place of nowhere. Or, if you think about it, nowhere is everywhere, a place that is everywhere. And for Whitten, who was part of the African diaspora, Atopolis means for him, and he writes about this with some eloquence, this space that you have to make for yourself, this space that is the result of a traumatic disruption, that then has to be reconstituted. And so this painting, which is made up of thousands of little acrylic mosaics that he handmade and then glued onto the canvas. And the canvas is enormous. It's 3 meters by 2 meters. Looks like the cosmos, if you think about looking up at the stars. Or maybe if you're looking down from the stars, it looks like an archipelago of islands in the sea. Thousands of little islands, each next to the other. And then they coalesce or they spread apart. And I look at this painting and I think about this painting often because it's a metaphor, in my mind at least, of the way we imagine our galleries. Each gallery a separate island, each island connected either loosely or distantly to every other gallery. Each gallery in the museum telling a story, but the story never being permanent, because part of being on an island is that to do anything, you have to go somewhere. You have to leave the island to go to another island. And as you leave that island, it recedes in your memory as new memories are created. In this notion of a series of archipelagos making up the experience of the museum is fundamentally different from the idea of the museum that might have existed when we thought of ourselves as a torpedo moving through time, where we were directed, we were on a mission, and the mission was always in a linear, progressive unfolding. We wanted to create a museum that was more complicated, more nuanced than that could adapt to the times, that could change, that could tell many different stories simultaneously, some of them complementing each other's, some of them actually contradicting, some of them fraught, some of them joyous. So in real time, what does that look like? This is one of the installations we did in 2019 when we opened the new building. We commissioned Amy Silman, an artist living in New York, to rummage through our collection and imagine her ideal exhibition. And she came up with the idea of the shape of shapes. And if you think about how artists work, they work with color, they work with line, they work with form. Shape for them is part of their vocabulary. And so here she is playing with the different shapes that are meaningful to her, creating rhymes and rhythms, often bringing works of art out of our storage that have never been seen before. And presenting them in an unusual format. You can see paintings and drawings leaning up against each other and the wall, something we would never do under normal circumstances. And that's part of the value of working with an artist. They disrupt the way we think. They challenge our perceptions, our ideas of what a gallery should be. And they make us aware of how much art means to us. Or here in what turned out to be one of the most interesting and controversial installations, this is really around Picasso, and you see in the background Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, that great painting of 1907 that many often consider as one of the fundamental works of the 20th century, but certainly one of the most important paintings in our collection, juxtaposed with Faith Ringgold, an African-American artist, Die 5, a painting that shows a kind of anarchic scene of a riot on a street. But Faith, during the 1960s, she died, alas, very recently, during the 1960s, she came almost every day to the Museum of Modern Art to look at Picasso, to study Picasso, to learn from Picasso. And in a way, Die is it's not so much as an homage to Picasso, but it is a response to Picasso. She's drawing on his technique and his approach, but obviously creating something very different. When we showed this, our audience really split into two. Those who were deeply upset that we would bring a contemporary work into the presence of Picasso, that we would bring the work of a black female into discussion with Picasso, that somehow this was reducing Picasso to less than his extraordinary status. Or you had people who were thrilled that this conversation was taking place, that understood that Faith Ringgold was making Picasso contemporary. It wasn't the other way around. The fact that she could look to Picasso and learn from him made Picasso relevant today, made Picasso alive today. And I actually enjoyed the fact that this polarized people, that it got them talking, that it made people either uncomfortable or ecstatic. But the most important thing, as I tried to remind everyone, was that every one of these galleries was going to change. And this gallery has long since changed. That the gambit of the 2019 project was that no gallery was permanent, like that archipelago of Jack Whitten. There was constant movement. And it wasn't just the movement of you as a visitor through the museum, there was constant movement of the collection. Because our collection itself is an extraordinary resource, but even more importantly, we have almost 200,000 objects and can only show about 2,000 a year. So to do that collection justice means having to constantly change it, and having to constantly change it means having to constantly change the stories we tell, because the works of art are all different. And that brings us back to that fundamental idea of being a work in progress. Here, another exhibition that really looked at the idea of electricity and photography and film, the three elements that were modern at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. Light. Imagine cities first that only were lit by candle, then cities that were lit by gaslight, and ultimately by the 19th century, end of the 19th century, lit by electricity, at least in parts of Europe. But also film as a new medium, the moving image, and photography. And this was important because, again, breaking up that narrative that tried to explain our history simply as a progress of painting or sculpture needed to be reformulated to show that actually every medium participated in rethinking what it meant to be modern. Or here, an installation that dealt with artists who responded with a language of abstraction in the wake of the horror and trauma of the Second World War, where you could no longer represent in a figurative way the terrors that had been seen literally by your own eyes over the course of the first part of the 1940s. And on the right, you have a beautiful Mark Rothko. But interestingly, on the left is a painting by V.S. Gaitonde, an Indian artist working at exactly the same time, who did not know, at least at the moment he painted this, Rothko. He came to know Rothko later, but might have known about Rothko perhaps through black and white reproductions, but actually found the same language that Rothko found. And why I think this installation is important is not only the resonance between Gaitonde and Rothko, but the fact that when Gaitonde painted this in the early 1960s, we collected it almost at the moment he painted it, even though we had not shown it until 2019. And here's the point, that the Museum of Modern Art has multiple imaginaries, as I've been trying to suggest, and its collection itself is an imaginary. The imaginary that is realized on the walls, that which you and I get to see when we visit, and the imaginary that's in the basement, that is never seen, but that still exists, and that has the potential, when resurfaced, to change how we think about the museum. Or here an installation in one of our galleries that looks at new building techniques. And what you see in front of you is the facade from the UN, which was one of the first prefabricated facades in New York City. So it was a curtain wall that was applied to the structure of the building. And behind it, you see a Jacques Tati film of the modern city. And what we're trying to get at is the resonance between new architectural languages and how you actually experienced the city, and bringing architecture and design into the galleries together with film, photography, and other media was again about creating a new imaginary in which these media, which we know are part of the modern idea, but which had been, in a way, siloed over time, come back together. Or here, a beautiful installation shot from an exhibition that is currently on view called Intimate Knowledge. And you see in the background Audubon and Kanga's beautiful tapestry that some of you might recognize from 2 Venice Biennales ago, and in the foreground, a glass piece by Kirsten Bretsch. And this exhibition examines the way certain kinds of knowledge that are non-academic are transmitted orally through different communities, almost as if they were alchemical, shared in private ways. It's about the imagination of information. And again, each one of these installations is a temporary installation of our own collection. In other words, the permanent dimension of it is the collection, but there's nothing permanent about its installation. And in fact, over the course of any year, almost 30% of our galleries will change. Let me conclude with this very beautiful installation shot of Montien Bunma's House of Hope, a work that he did after his wife had died in the late 1990s. His wife died, I think, in 1995 or 96. He made this shortly thereafter. And this is a work about memory. It's a work about loss. It's a work about fragility. Each of the thousands of beads that hang from that scaffold is made out of a medicinal material or an herb, as are the pigments that make up that very powerful, almost organic wall behind it. So you smell this work before you see it. You actually begin to recognize that something is there before you actually know what it is. And then when you come in, it's a very meditative space. It allows you to think about loss, but tellingly about hope, about possibility. And so when you leave the space, the perfume of the medicinal herbs is somehow still in your nostrils and on your clothing, and it lingers with you. So as this work fades from view visually, it remains part of your mindscape. It remains with you as an idea. So let me try and wrap all of this together for you with a few thoughts. The museum we have tried to imagine in New York is one that builds on that idea of Edouard Glissant, of the archipelago, of this sense of imagination that Jack Whitten tried to capture with his painting of Etopolis, this sense of wandering and fragility, openness and drift, that the museum is a place where you wander, where you drift, where you encounter. It's an approach that has a broad, maybe even a sweeping, multi-dimensional perspective. But it does not pretend to be all-inclusive or comprehensive. Like André Malraux with his Musée Imaginaire, it recognizes that no museum can be comprehensive. It's only in your mind that you can make it complete. The museum that results from this is like a collage composed of art from many different places and times. And the history it reveals is contingent and relational. In this sense, it builds on and responds to Malraux's imaginary museum. But where Malraux could act as an auteur, to borrow a term from the film world, and build his museum free from any physical or financial constraints, we, Suhanya and I, and all of you who work in museums, live with the limits of time and space, not to mention financial resources and the nature of the collections we have. That is, we have to constantly negotiate between the ideas that govern us, that animate us, that excite us, and the realities of our place. The imaginary that results from this is like that painting of Etopolis, composed of many overlapping and intersecting fragments. It is not dependent on a single vantage point because it offers both the point of view of the institution, which is in itself made up of many different points of view, while recognizing that each of us, as we move through the museum, creates our own perspectives. Annabelle's little card that I have on my desk, and you call yourself a museum, she is as much a part of our institution as a Demoiselle d'Avignon. She just is a part in a different way. Rather than trying to provide a seamless history or narrative, the emphasis is on the fact that the whole is always made up of its parts, parts that overlap, support, contradict, and compete with each other. It is in the real and perceived gaps of knowledge or information where the imaginaries of the viewer and the institution don't always align, where perspectives are in competition with each other, that importance lies. It's in those gaps that importance lies. Like the fragmented components of Atopolis, it is the gaps and the omissions that matter as much as the points of cohesion. They create a kind of constructive tension that allows each of us to discover new meanings and ideas in our movement through the museum. It is in these interstitial spaces, what the great cultural theorist Homi Bhabha calls in-between spaces, the junctures between galleries or works of art, or the memories we carry from one part of the museum to another, or the gaps in culture and understanding between the institution and its viewers, that we can create a museum that acts like an archipelago, that differentiates itself from museums that claim authority and clarity. This museum acknowledges its fragility and tenuousness. It acknowledges that there are always multiple perspectives and readings, and that the viewer is integral to the imaginaries created by the museum. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Wonderful lecture, food for thought, especially for us here in Hong Kong. You know, M+, we are just 3 years old since we opened. And one of the reasons we invited you to present this lecture is to hear the thoughts from a director who has been at the helm for 30 years of an institution that is coming up to 100 years, with the same ambition of being an institution that covers museum collections of modern and contemporary art, but cross-disciplinary, just like we do: film, design, architecture, art. And to listen to your journey, which you captured so eloquently, from the torpedo to an archipelago. When I think from where we are, we as museums are thinking about the complex histories that we are responding to, that we have collected from our place, that inform how those collections are made. And our project here, which is so young in many ways compared to yours, yet at the same time we do share quite similar urgencies around how representation is managed, how diversity is acknowledged, how the complexities of histories that are factual are also displayed, with the challenges that they bring. So when, as a museum that's just beginning our journey, and I see how you have worked through what are actually very significant shifts in how the collections are shown. And I'm talking about the 2019 collection hangs in particular. Can you expand a little bit more about the challenge that you faced from audiences who perhaps didn't always like what they saw?
Thank you, Suhanya. One of the intriguing aspects I found when I arrived at the museum was how much everybody loved what they saw. People were happy with the institution. If you were relatively new or had fresh eyes, what you saw were rather small galleries, poorly lit, with shabby carpets and terrible walls that were crumbling often, and installations that were static. Now, of course, they were static, but with extraordinarily beautiful works of art. And people talked about the intimacy of those galleries. And I remember once in a conversation with John Elderfield, who was chief curator at the time, talking about intimacy. He said, well, there are two kinds of intimacies. There's the intimacy of being in a small, crowded space with too many people, and there's the intimacy of being in a space in which you feel comfortable. They're not the same thing. And I remember when we did the Taniguchi project, which was in 2004, and substantially increased the scale of the museum to accommodate a much larger collection, so we could show more of it, but also to accommodate a much larger public because our audience had grown. There was a huge critique of the museum as being too large, too cold, too corporate, and that it had lost its intimacy. And I knew that 20 years later, that would long be forgotten, that the 2004 project would be the norm. It takes people a while to accommodate change, even if they talk about a desire for change. But I think it's also a museum's responsibility. If you build an audience, you want to carry that audience with you. The goal was never to lose the audience over the changes we were making, but to help our public and new publics see something new and different that was equally interesting and worthwhile. So it's been a journey. There have been ups and downs. There have been moments that felt very frustrating, but there are also moments of enormous reward when you realize that our audience itself is much younger than it was when I arrived. When I arrived, our average visitor, I think, was 55 or 56, primarily female, almost over 70% white. Today, our audience is much younger. I think the average age is around 40 or 44. Gender balance is still pretty much the same, but only 52% of our audience is white. And those changes are important because they reflect the demographics of the country at large, as well as the demographics of our visitors. And they're also important because they respond to the changes we've made in what is displayed and who is displaying it and how it's displayed. So change, I think, is inherently good, but it's also one that you have to be willing to work at.
It's good advice. With the shift in age, I mean, I should say for M+, our audience is very similar to yours. The bulk of our audiences are between the ages of 18 and 40, and 70% actually are not from Hong Kong, 30% from Hong Kong, and of that 70%, 50% from mainland China. Of course, this is an institution that opened during pandemic, and we're still opening up as a city to a broader, bigger, longer, larger audience that used to be in Hong Kong. And the sense of what they are encountering for sure is seeing things that you cannot see anywhere else. This is a destination to see things that are unique to this institution, and within this institution, I think also within the region. That brings with it a huge obligation, responsibility that we take very seriously about what we collect, how we show it. I was very interested to hear that one of your principles after 2019 was that you would always change your collection galleries very regularly. Now, this is a balance that is got to do with resource as much as it is to do with an urgency to share collections. how do your curators respond to this challenge of having to rotate all the time, and how does that tension lie with, say, educators within the institution who want to establish a curricula within, say, schools that need a continuity?
So it's a great question, and it's certainly what we are in the process still, 3 years later, 4 years later, trying to work out. We were very lucky. We had several years leading up to our 2019 opening to plan out not just the first set of installations, but even the set thereafter. Then with the pandemic, we were given another bonus time to work on that. So it wasn't until really 2023 that the magnitude and pace of these changes hit us. And I would say it puts a lot of strain on the institution, certainly financially, but also just in terms of people having enough time to do the thinking, the testing, and the work. That said, the current cohort of curators and chief curators are completely committed to this idea. It is the foundational idea of the present, that it isn't just to air more of what is otherwise invisible. It's also a belief in creating a multidimensional experience for our visitors that is never the same. That even though many of our visitors might be first-time visitors, and therefore whatever they see will be new to them, it is a principle that the museum itself is always changing. And this goes back to, I think, a foundational idea that we're a work in progress. And that if you don't do that, you whether you intend to or not, you create canons, because obviously what's on view becomes canonical. And so if you are trying to, in my case, explode the canon, but even if that isn't even if you're not trying to explode the canon, you're trying to amplify the canon, expand the canon, distort the canon, you need to do it by change. You need to show that it is not stable. I think any institution committed to the present requires that sense of change and flux, and in that flux is possibility.
I still remember a little workshop we conducted together when a group of interns I think they were CMAP colleagues, who were asking about M+, and they said one of our principles is actually to expand the canon. And you asked, but do we need a canon? And I said, I think we do need to have histories that are understood as, they're like veins in a body. You need to have them that you're recognizable. But you also have to recognize that they are multiple, plural, and in parallel. But it has been sitting there as constantly, go back to it, that question, do we really need canons? And if so, why? And so it begs the question then, why expand a canon? Because it assumes hierarchy, which of course is something we all think about a lot.
I would think it's a central question to the work we do in museums. Canons are convenient. They provide a scaffold in which to understand things, but they're also very limiting. And I certainly felt, and still feel, that if we're going to talk about a canon, we have to talk about it as canons in the plural. That I'm still wary of the canonical approach. It's why I have gravitated to thinking about archipelagos and this sense of drift. Doesn't mean that there aren't fixed points. There are islands in the sea. But there are many of those islands, and the sequence in which you experience them can be almost infinite. And trying to move away from the absoluteness of a canon or canons, especially when you're dealing with the art of the present, where how that work will be finally or understood over a longue durée is outside our field of vision. It just seems to me that it offers us a kind of liberating dimension.
You have spoken about collections. Fundamentally, the lecture has been anchored there. Can I ask what the relationship between your program around exhibitions sits in dialogue with your collections?
So we have multiple strands to our exhibition program. One strand is to look at our collection, find a work of art or works of art, and do a deep dive into that work. The Red Studio that we did last year was taking Matisse's great painting and then trying to understand everything we could around it. Another strand is really to give free rein to our curators to imagine something that is really interesting to them that might have a tangential relationship to material in the museum, but isn't necessarily dependent on the collection. I see Dorian Chung, who did, when he was, thank you, Dorian, who, when he was at the Museum of Modern Art, did a spectacular exhibition on Tokyo 1955 to 1970, if I remember correctly, that certainly explored works of art in our collection, but actually opened us up to works of art that we had not previously paid attention to. So we use our exhibition program to ventilate and percolate and expand what we do. And then sometimes there's just the opportunity that comes along to do something that may or may not relate directly to the collection. But I would say at this point, because a collection is sufficiently broad, there's always some hook, but we don't try to specifically relate the temporary exhibition program to the collection, but it nonetheless happens with some frequencies. Maybe the best way to describe that. Is that a...
Yeah, I just also want to touch on this because it is also the relationship between curatorial interest and then the institution's need to ensure audiences are also captured. You know, that there is, that we persuade our curators to also consider the needs that maybe audiences are really keen to think about, say, digital work, or how you pivoted, say, how quick you were in responding to AI and that environment, and then working with Rafiq so quickly.
I think in our case, it started, it was certainly pre-existed well before I arrived, but I hope I've been able to continue it. We're a curatorially driven institution, so the exhibition program grows out of the interests of our curators. Yes, in conversation and dialogue with me and with others at the institution, but at the end of the day, the program starts with a curatorial point of view, somebody wanting to explore something. And my role in that is sometimes to provoke questions, certainly to be a friend and a guide when necessary, but mostly to then take all those ideas that have been put forward and to think about how can we weave those into a coherent season. I don't do this alone. I obviously do this with really great colleagues. So that impact with the public becomes a result of our capacity to take the 7 or 8 exhibitions that might be on at any one time and compose them in such a way that they would be interesting to a general audience, as opposed to sitting down and saying, we need to do an exhibition on X because that will be appealing. Every curator I've ever worked with has wanted to do an exhibition that appeals to the public. I've never met a curator that said, oh, I want to do an exhibition that nobody wants to go to. So I don't worry too much about curators being interested in engaging the public. And I think it's very important if you want an institution that is foregrounded in ideas and research, that you privilege research and ideas. And then we're lucky enough that we can do multiple exhibitions at the same time, that if we have an exhibition that appeals only to someone interested in photography, we can balance that by doing an exhibition that appeals to people who are interested in mid-century modern, or another group that might be interested in architecture or design. And so it's in the assembling of the season that we can create that impact we are looking for with our public.
You touched also on the question of, knowing that it's not one but many, archipelago as being the metaphor, but of course you cannot. It's impossible to be totally encyclopedic and global in your collection's interests. So, when we think about how do you, knowing that the US is an extremely multicultural country. New York as a city is extraordinarily diverse, but at the same time there will be holes, if you like, or absences of representation historically as well as within, the holdings, but maybe it could be addressed with exhibition. How do you address the critical voice that says, "But where am I in this story?"
No, that's an excellent question, and one that we, as well as every other museum, thinks about. I mean, first of all, I think gaps are interesting. I'm not interested in the encyclopedic or the universal because I think it's a chimera. I don't think it's actually possible. It's why I'm so interested in André Malraux and his recognition of that problem and his attempt to create a different alternative, a possibility that allows you to imagine the whole, even though the whole can never be constructed. And those gaps and omissions are really important. So how you make or how you create the invitation to those who don't feel represented by what's on the wall to engage with the institution is constantly a challenge. I think there are different ways of doing it, partnering with other institutions and creating bilateral programs that are beneficial to both institutions, recognizing that, especially in a city like New York, where there are many different museums, that what you can't see at one or can't experience at one, you can experience at another. And from the point of view of the public, the opportunity is there. It's just not there at any one moment. I think often about the backbone of this extraordinary museum, Uli Sig's great collection of contemporary Chinese art, in a way that gives a definition here that a museum like ours could never have, because those great works of art are already here. And in any event, our audience's interests are different. But that doesn't mean that M+ and MoMA, for instance, couldn't find common ground that allowed for interesting exhibitions and installations that would amplify what we do and amplify what you do. So I think you have to, in a way, invent it as you go along, but also become comfortable in the fact that you can't be all things to all people, that actually it's fine not to be able to do everything, as long as what you do really well, and with enough humility to recognize that it's only a fraction of a whole.
Before I go to the public, I just want to ask one question, which is, looking back at all the things that you've achieved, what are, say, 3 wonderful things that you would say are on the top 10 list for you?
Oh, that's like asking a parent, which child do you like the most? I suppose the things right now, as I think about that I'm I'm proudest of. The merger with MoMA PS1 that brought us into alliance with a fundamentally different institution. If you think about it, this small, scrappy place outside on Long Island City in an abandoned school building with 25 employees, working with this large Manhattan-based institution with almost 800 employees, to make that work, to get the energy that we could both produce together to happen, I think was essential, and everybody benefited. MoMA PS1, which was on the verge of going bankrupt when we merged with them, survived. We changed because of the energy from MoMA PS1 and the way they think. So I'm very, that sits well with me. It feels like it was something to
A good thing.
It
was a good thing.
The creation of CMAP, Contemporary and Modern Art Perspectives in a Global World, which was a research-based initiative to work with colleagues from around the world, not to try and build a MoMA in Shanghai or a MoMA in Hong Kong or in Abu Dhabi, but rather to say that it's people that make the difference, and to create a platform where colleagues from around the world could work together and learn together, to create a model for how knowledge can be created that was not just bilateral, but multilateral. And of course, a whole range of acquisitions that have changed the museum, from Montien Bunma to the Silverman collection of Fluxus and the Cisneros collection of Latin American art, and the exhibitions that, I think were transformative to the field. So when we did Richard Serra's monumental sculptures, I don't think there was another museum in the world that could have, at that time, done that exhibition with Richard, or Marina Abramovich's The Artist is Present, which brought performance into the heart of an institution that had previously only thought about performance tangentially, but also brought performance as an art form into focus in a way that I think has become central to a lot of other places. And there were other places that might have done that project with Marina, but we were lucky enough to have been the place that did it. So it's a combination of the exhibitions, the acquisitions, and in the end, most importantly, the programs.
Yeah, I think it's the palimpsest, and it's over time that richness really begins to seep into and become a skin in the city. So we've got a couple of questions very quickly. I think we might be able to do one or two. The first is, I'm going to read it to you so all of you can hear. When the torpedo carrying all the history behind its tail over time, does it get too heavy for the torpedo to move forward? How to keep its explosiveness?
Well, that's a great question. It's a question that I began pondering when I arrived at the museum 30 years ago, and I can honestly say it's a question I have not solved 30 years later, although I know what the solution is. It is simply that nobody will do it. Solution is to shed the tail, to have the courage to walk away from all those great paintings, all those great objects that predate you pick the date, and have enough confidence that the future will be as interesting in the past. That is the confidence that our founding trustees had. And the idea that was pursued for a while of deaccessioning the past, often by trades with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, for the future was the right idea, even if it didn't work at the time in the late 1940s when we tried it. We do deaccession to buy other works of art only, but our deaccessioning is still reasonably haphazard rather than programmatic and systematic. We have begun this last year now a systematic approach to deaccessioning to see if we can't ramp that up. We need to put more of our collection out on loan, long-term loan to other institutions. But my greatest anxiety for the Museum of Modern Art is that ultimately the torpedo gets so heavy that we become just like any other museum, except our starting date is circa 1880 instead of 5000 BC.
Governments everywhere are slashing budgets for the arts. How do we convince people that arts and culture and history are still relevant?
Well, that is the business that all of us who are privileged to work in museums are in. I mean, I think the way we do it, and M+ is a beautiful example, is to demonstrate that our programs are so exciting that millions, not thousands, millions of people come to them every year. And those millions of people are invested in our success and they're invested in our future. And governments tend to like numbers, and our numbers, when you look at them, are mighty good. And I think we have to advocate for ourselves. We have to produce the programs that people find valuable, that they will miss if they don't exist. But it's a battle. Of course it's a battle. As budgets get tighter, it's easier to cut in areas where you don't think there will be a backlash. But I happen to believe that the arts are not just some add-on to our lives. They are central to our lives in the way health is and in the way education is.
I think actually during COVID, it became very clear how important the institutions were to people's lives. I know certainly at M+ that was the case, because it became the one place that people could come and gather, where other places it became impossible to do that. And that social space of museums are, we as human beings, our social creatures, needed that.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, you walk into the Great Turbine Hall at Tate Modern, and if that isn't one of the most exhilarating experiences in life, to be surrounded by all those people, the energy, they become part of the motor that drives the institution. And I think governments understand that. Sometimes you have to drag a minister to see it, but it's hard not to recognize it when you're there.
I think before we wrap up, I know we need to wrap up now, but I just wanted to end by asking, just a question for both of us to what advice would we give to a next generation of museum leaders in the mid-21st century into the 22nd century? What is the advice we would give?
Suhanya?
I would start by saying we have to work together more. It's a collaborative scenario, because it's exactly what you said. We carry our torpedoes, if you like, and we should be sharing more than ever.
That is for sure. I guess I would say don't forget your Valium. These are complex and often very difficult jobs that are profoundly rewarding. But I think the big change that I've seen is exactly what you're talking about. That we think of ourselves as an ecosystem that works together, and that there's such enormous pleasure that comes from learning from colleagues, from engaging with people who think differently than you, and who can teach you new and different things. And none of our institutions, at the end of the day, can or should be standalone institutions. So building those networks of relationships is what will ensure the future of our institutions.
I agree. It's together that we advocate as well, in the face of others who might say they're not as important as we think they are. Thank you, Glenn Lowry, for being with us this afternoon. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Suhanya.
Thank you, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. It's such an honor to have you here in the Grand Stair with Glenn and Suhanya. Thank you, Glenn, for an excellent talk earlier. It gave us such food for thought and inspiration, and for this conversation just now. It was really special, and I'm really happy we could all be here together for it. And I know that you're eager to probably head out, but we'd like to just do one last photograph with Glenn and Suhanya facing, they're gonna get up and stand with the audience so we can take a little photograph. And while they're getting up to do the photograph, just a reminder to leave your headsets when you leave the hall today, and we'll just let Winnie join. WOPAY Talk, which will be happening next Saturday, just right here, same time, same place. Thank you so very much.